and I am going to introduce a person for many people around the country. You may know David as a syndicated columnist, but in Tucson, he is our dear treasure and friend, and has been a great friend of Ollie for a long time. And he's a cartoonist and columnist for the Arizona Daily Star, where he began drawing cartoons back when Geronimo was just a paper boy, right around 1986. A Pulitzer finalist, Fitz's cartoons are syndicated to over 800 news publications around the world. Last year, the Arizona Press Club voted him the best columnist in the state. What do they know? No one in the news or in his audience is safe when his pen is uncapped. That's scary for me since I'm the only one he can see today. But he is described as a flaming moderate at the fringe of America's center. Fitz is a snappy dresser who loves reading hate mail from readers and making kids laugh. So without further ado, I am going to stop sharing, and we are going to say welcome, David Fitzsimmons, and thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for that very generous and kind introduction. That introduction was so kind. My father would have loved it, and my mom might have actually believed it. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you, friends of the Osher Lifelong Learning Center, because I love the speakers you get. Aside from myself, today I'm going to be an exception, because I promise you that my presentation will essentially be valueless and data-free. As Scott mentioned, I am a columnist. I write a weekly humor column. And as well, I am an endangered species. I am an American political cartoonist. And the wonderful thing about Zoom is the privilege to see inside people's homes and to see into their lives. Behind me, what you see is my workspace, my home studio. I've worked at home now for about 20 years, and I love working from home. My dear wife, who just began working from home, she did tell me that she wishes that I would work from room. But hey, it's my house, isn't it? Our house. Behind me, you see, this is my drawing board. Down here is my editor, my pet cat, Finn. And this is where I spend 8 to maybe 12 hours a day when I'm not exercising, trying to recover some physical fitness after racking my brains coming up with cartoon ideas. The bulk of my presentation today will be a PowerPoint. For some of you, it might be familiar. For others, I hope it's new. I've added some new material. Before I go to my PowerPoint, I want to share a voicemail with you, because one of the questions I'm almost always asked is, do you get hate mail and angry phone calls? And yes, I do. And do they bother me? Not so much. But I do enjoy hearing them, and I'm going to cue this one up, and hopefully you all can hear this one.
Remember you back from Rincon High School. Thought you were kind of clever then, but you have really disintegrated. We know that you hate Trump, but don't you think you should give an honor at least to the Office for the POTUS? We ignored your Muslim for 8 years. Your side is causing nothing but havoc and destroying this country.
And that's just a small example of the kind of mail I listen to almost daily. And I have to confess, honestly, it does have impact on me after a while. I do feel a kind of despair about the depth of civic literacy. But then again, it doesn't really surprise me. In a publication called The Hill, which is published in the Capitol in Washington, D.C., there was an interesting story about statistical reviews of how smart we Americans are. And a majority of Americans cannot identify the countries the United States fought against in the Second World War. So civic literacy doesn't really surprise me that much. It's just part of life here in our great nation. I'm going to begin with my PowerPoint. Here it comes. I'm cranking it up here. We're going to do a share screen, and hopefully this will work. Boom, there we go. That's me. What a handsome old man I am. 64 years young. I started at the Arizona Daily Star back when Geronimo was a paper boy. This is the sort of mail I get, and this is not edited. You're partisan, biased, and unfair. This critic is absolutely right. This individual thought he or she was insulting me, but in fact, he or she was accurately describing a commentary journalist. All commentary journalists, whether it's Rush Limbaugh, Dave Fitzsimmons, or the folks on Fox or MSNBC, are in fact partisan, biased, and unfair. It's my job description. There I am, Fitzsimmons. It's an Irish name. It means bastard child of a tailor. And that quail on my shoulder, it is a self-portrait. Yeah. Yeah, this is how I behave when I'm alone in my studio. Yeah, I'm not letting the stress get to me. I got my start early in life. When my brothers returned from beautiful, exotic Vietnam, they spoke about the war, they politicized me. And unlike my chums when I was growing up, who had great interest in sports and such, I was just a fanatic about history and art as well. Where do you get your ideas from? Well, I don't sniff markers anymore since apparently they have carcinogenic inks in them. I get my cartoon ideas from long hours of labor. That is 90% of the job. Free associating my way to an analogy or a metaphor that will make my opinion interesting, fresh, and palatable. I got my start, wow, back here, 7th grade. Best 3 years of my life in Mrs. Bagwell's classroom. This answers the question, where do we cartoonists come from? Yeah, she would be working so hard at the front of the classroom, and I couldn't resist but render a likeness to the dear woman. Perhaps you recognize her. I have lunch with this dear woman. To this day, I saw her about 2 months ago, Mrs. Terry Bagwell. She's still alive, and we're still great friends, and I'm so grateful to her because when she came back to my desk and confiscated this drawing, she saved my life. She instructed me to, hey, if you're gonna not be constructive in my classroom, could you at least try to be constructive by signing up for a yearbook and newspaper staff, which I did. I entered that classroom after school, and my life was forever changed, for I had found my own kith and kin. Yep, I do get lots of mail. I remember going to my first cartoonist conference in San Diego in the early 80s and complaining to the big grown-up cartoonists, the big grown-up men and women who were cartooning, about the fact I was getting angry letters, and they looked at me like I was crazy. Of course you get angry mail. That's how you measure your success. Paul Conrad, the cartoonist for the Los Angeles Times, the late, great Paul Conrad, bragged at that point that one reader was so upset with his cartoon that he had rented a dump truck to dump horse manure on the street in front of the LA Times. Me, I just had to get a couple of restraining orders. This is a sample of the mail I do get. Dear blank, you're a big blank. Hate your blank and cart. They look to me like you can just go blank yourself, blank you, sign blanking anonymous, eat blank. Yeah, as if this individual didn't know I could recognize my own mother's handwriting. I love these type of letters. They make my day. And I must say, they do roll off my back. I have a theory of life that helps me cope. I inherited this from my dear late mother. My parents perished 40 years ago, both from cancer when I was young. I ended up being their caregiver during their years of illness. And my mother had a great saying that generally accompanied her and his tasteless sense of humor. And that was a saying some of you might recognize. It was about certain material hitting a fan. Here's life, there's the fan, here's poop, she would note that from time to time poop would fly in this direction, striking the fan, and you, being a human being, would oftentimes find yourself located right there. Her advice was, it's going to happen. You can either get angry and have a fruitless response, or laugh it off and keep moving forward. I do laugh things off to a fair degree, and that's why I make a pretty good living on the side as a cartoonist doing stage comedy. I've performed in Toronto, Reno, Beverly Hills, New York City, and this is my Al Franken moment. Typically what I do is I pull people up out of the audience, draw them, interrogate them, and have a little Don Rickles fun with them. Yep, pretty handsome old fella right there. I also produce a theatrical show, and some of you familiar with Ollie here in Tucson may recognize an Ollie speaker among my cast. This past show at the Rialto, which I had written, featured our mayor, former mayor, Mayor Rothschild, our elected new mayor, Mayor Regina Romero, Mark Russell, a man I am flattered to know considers me his friend. And then on the right of Mark Russell, you might recognize a kid named Frank Figluzzi. We filled the Rialto Theater. And some of you might want to know why it's called the Green Room, where performers gather before a show. I don't know, but there it is, lime green. This is the cast for last year's show. Mayor Rothschild, some dame, that is my beautiful wife, my friend Mark Russell, me, and Bobby Rich in the lime green room. You may have noticed that an FBI informant infiltrated our cast this past year, Frank Figluzzi, who also gave us a wonderful program here with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute recently. A delightful man and a fellow I consider a great American patriot. Also, I like to pay back. I have with my mother having perished from breast cancer and myself a survivor. I do believe in laughing delusionally at suffering when it hits you. And so do the 7 ladies who perform comedy about the stuff they went through and survived. And one of them came up with this wonderful, tasteless idea for the show's name, Titters, making strides against breast cancer. Viva Tucson is my tribute to Tucson's mixed culture. I primarily produce this show to get white people to head south of Main Street to come to the south side to hear the music that emanates from the heart and soul of Tucson itself. Here's my career path as a cartoonist. High school, the 70s. I worked for an off-campus paper too, an underground paper at the time as well. In 74 to 77, I worked for the college newspaper at the U of A. And I found out during this time, thanks Freedom of Information Act, the American FBI kept a file on me because of my anti-war cartoons, which were informed by insights I garnered from both of my brothers who had served there and had turned against the war. I graduated in 77 with a BFA in graphic design, and no cartoonist had died or retired that year. In that year, there were over 270 editorial cartoonists working in the United States. So I survived upon graduating as a muralist, sign painter, illustrator, landed my first newspaper job at the Oklahoma City Times as a map maker, worked my way up within that newspaper staff all the way to being an illustrator. My illustrations won national awards. I was recognized by the Virginian Pilot Ledger Star as a noteworthy graphics artist and was hired away to beautiful Norfolk, Virginia, where I worked for 3 glorious years as a graphics director, managing a staff of artists and photographers and winning national design awards. I also made one of the best friends of my life at that time. His name was Tony Snow. He was an editorial writer, and he was a very conservative thinker, and we were best friends. And Tony landed a job across the bay at a paper called the Daily Press of Newport News. And you can see that I ended up working there as well, because Tony hired me away so I could enjoy my dream job of finally being an editorial cartoonist. Hey, Tony, I said, I'm to the left of Leon Trotsky and you still want to hire me? He said, yeah, I'm to the right of Attila Hun. We'll have great fun. He was right. Every morning we would quarrel and every afternoon we would part friends and hit the pub and have a wonderful time. He ended up being the press secretary for President George Bush in the Bush White House, a wonderful fellow who sadly passed a few years ago. And then I was hired away in 1986 by the Arizona Daily Star, just in time for Arizona to elect Evan Mecham, Arizona's governor, a great subject for a cartoonist to cut his or her teeth on. I'm syndicated to over 700 newspapers worldwide, which is fantastic considering there are only 700 newspapers left. And I do want to talk about the state of newspapering in the United States. They're dying. There are at least 1,500 American cities that have lost their small size to moderate sized newspapers. These areas are called news deserts. My work is syndicated. Here's an example of the syndicate. Upper left-hand corner, it's called Kegel Cartoons. You can search Google for Kegel Cartoons and you will find my cartoons there. Also, other cartoonists that are carried by the syndicate, including international cartoonists that are fun to look at to get their perspective on what's going on in our world. My cartoons appear in papers like the Washington Post. This is a cartoon about Kavanaugh walking in, the approved Kavanaugh walking into the Supreme Court and the Statue of Liberty gagged and blindfolded. Back to newspapers. Here is a small list of newspapers which are troubled financially at the moment. Shrinking staffs, layoffs, furloughs, not weathering the coronavirus well. Newspapers were already plunging in sales and subscription rates and advertising taking a huge hit. So the Denver Post is in trouble. The Tampa Bay Times is in trouble. Detroit Free Press is in trouble. The Examiner, the Baltimore Sun, Dallas Morning News, the great Kansas City Star, Miami Herald moved out of their glorious offices into small, tiny office space. Sacramento Bee, the McClatchy chain owning the Sacramento Bee and others declared bankruptcy recently. New York Daily News is troubled. Buffalo News, Times-Picayune, St. Louis Post-Dispatch shrinking. Chicago Tribune, staff slashed. Cleveland Plain Dealer. How bad is it for newspapers? The Cleveland Plain Dealer is now produced by a total staff of writers, editors, photographers, and designers, numbering 18 employees. So, newspapers are suffering. What's replacing them? OAN Network, Fox News, Breitbart, I'd say for the most part, right-wing propaganda sites that have been very aggressive about, number one, hammering and discrediting mainstream media because, we are the enemy of the people, and replacing such media with their own fringe propaganda voices. 23, an important number. 23 is the number of editorial cartoonists still working in the United States of America. I recently enjoyed a Zoom conference of American editorial cartoonists coupled with Canadian cartoonists, which brings that number up to 30 in the Northern Hemisphere. So we've gone from 270 in my youth to 23. I have to quote an NPR commentator, Ira Glass, who once said that newspaper editorial cartoons are a 17th century medium that have seen their day. Perhaps. Here I am, hard at work at the Arizona Daily Star, drawing board, making mistakes. And I say that because the cartoons you see are finished and polished, but I must draw at least 10 to 15 roughs every day to get there. The joyous part of my job is the mail. I want to read some of these for you. Feel free to write an apology letter. Might restore the credibility you think you have. Second one, Please, for the love of God, shut up. No one wants your opinion. And number 3, my favorite, educate yourself, you Bolshevik dumbass. Number 4, unedited for spelling. You're a political cartoonist. You have poor judgment with your brand, really disturbing choices. Shame on you. And that came from my editor and publisher. Boom. This is the most polite mail. I love this one. I think today's cartoon was in very bad taste. Here's some oldies but goodies for those of you who are unfamiliar with my work. And those of you who might be Trump supporters, I'm going to apologize for the pain you're going to feel because I am a critic of the president and his party. For example, this cartoon about vouchers, which I believe are being used to A, dismantle public education, and B, to feed private schools. This type of cartoon is what I would call an analogy or a metaphorical cartoon that in a sense uses a diagram to describe a historical event, actually describing my opinion of an historical event. Here's another visual, a blend of a visual metaphor. This one is a blend of a board game with a skull symbolizing death, and Uncle Sam is marching through the paces, sleepwalking. And this is about shootings. I have revised this cartoon 3 times and reprinted it because it never seems to change. The shooting cycle, upper left, horror, reporting, legal cases, NRA fires back, blaming each other, anniversary noted and forgotten until the next one. This cartoon is a wordless cartoon. My friend Clay Bennett, who draws in Tennessee, is a master of the wordless cartoon. George Floyd. We'll bring it up to the future. I mean the present, excuse me. Well, actually, before I head to George Floyd, 2017, when NFL players were taking a knee, which offended those who were more offended by an American protesting police brutality than they were offended by the police brutality itself. And my sense of the players protesting was this, that we should stand behind them because the United States of America's founding fathers would stand behind them. It's right there in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. This resulted in some anger. I like this one. I want to read about my beloved Wildcats. Then I remembered why I stopped buying your paper. You're an asshole, and I hope some days our paths cross. I can shake your hand, draw you in close, tell you what a prick you are, face to face. I wish you the best should that day occur. Ooh. History is context, which does make my job somewhat difficult because I have to rely on Americans knowing history. In spite of the fact that 1/3 of Americans can't tell you if the Civil War preceded the Revolutionary War or if it came after the Revolutionary War. Another 1/3 can't tell you if it was the British we were against or why we had a revolution in the first place. And more Americans can identify Snooki as a star of Jersey Shore than can identify the Bill of Rights as being a series of amendments to the American Constitution. Despite that, I'm going to believe history is context. Beginning with slavery. The slavers themselves with their knees on the neck of Africans. The white plantation owner, knees on the necks of the new involuntary Americans. After the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction, the Klansmen, the white supremacists, keeping the knee on the neck of Black Americans. And then even to the modern age of Jim Crow, with white Americans keeping their knee on the throat of Black Americans, up to the very present moment of the death of George Floyd, who could not breathe. For generations, these humans could not breathe. I felt obligated to draw that cartoon since I was astonished in a number of conversations to discover how many of my fellow Americans did not quite grasp the history behind the protests. Trump and race. One of the reasons there's two reasons I despise Trump. Number one, his disrespect for John McCain, a great American I considered a friend in spite of our political differences. Trump's words about this great American hero are despicable. Also, Trump encouraged racism, and I take it quite personally because of the following. This is my beautiful family, and they reside in Phoenix. And in the past 2 years, they've been accosted on 7 different occasions by racists in public, insulting them within earshot of my grandchildren. They're very patient, they're very loving, they either ignore it or just respond with patient love for the nonsense. But 3 times last year, 4 times this year. The racists are emboldened. This cartoon got a positive response from a few. Hey, not every Trump supporter is a racist, an argument I heard very, very often. That's true, says the voice in this cartoon. But every racist is a Trump supporter. I wonder why. Now, I got so much angry mail about this, but what was interesting about the mail disagreeing with me was that none of the writers could disagree with my assertion that racists tend to be Trump supporters. I wonder why. Here's an example of one piece of mail. Yeah, I'm a racist, jackass. I'm Mexican. Thought, isn't that funny? What an idiotic statement coming from a toilet paper rag of a newspaper. You people have seen your day. Soon you'll be a dinosaur and not able to spew your propaganda. Have a good day. I think what's most alarming about this is how gleeful she is about the death of journalism in the United States, and no doubt a creature of right-wing propaganda mills such as Fox, the OAN network, or Breitbart, which are all funded by wingnut billionaires. Here's a cartoon I drew recently, which I'm proud of. When Trump said, "Shoot the looters," for a split second, they paused. These looters. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Uh-oh. Do you ever stop whining or crying? No. Take me to your tweeter. This was fun to draw. John Bolton reads from his book. This was a cartoon from about 2 months ago. Good night, defense. Good night, moon. I heard it all. I was in the room. Good night, lies. Good night, Fox. Good night, orange. Goldilocks. Good night, cover-up and midnight Mitch. Good night, Putin and his... Good night, White House, you once called a dump. Good night, Rudy. Good night, Donald J. Trump. The one line that resonates with me in my memory is, good night, White House, you once called a dump. I heard this news about him referring to the White House as a dump when I was over in Germany, and on that day I was touring a ridiculous castle built by an autocratic monarch, and it certainly was not a dump. But to call the White House the people's house, the house that housed modest great Americans like Abraham Lincoln or Harry S. Truman, was just despicable. I couldn't think of a more piggish remark to come from an occupant of the White House than to call it a dump. About the COVID-19 pandemic, I am feeling awful these days that I am in an I told you so, I predicted this mode. It's disheartening that our government chose to abandon us throughout this tragedy. Here's Greta Thunberg, fun to draw. Hey, is no one willing to take the necessary steps to stop human-caused climate change? Anyone? Apparently, there's only one individual, one entity willing to stop the carnage of the planet. And that would be the pandemic, which succeeded by essentially shutting us down. Here's an example of another cartoon using a visual metaphor. If you squint, you can see it's a skull, suggesting death for these people who are gathering closely on a beach. we're good. The virus only shows up where the population is dense. Yeah, this population is pretty doggone dense. Pandemic masks, learn to identify them. Well, first you got your surgical mask, then you got your N95 respirator mask, and then you have the president's mask. Be sure and have you take your bleach and drink your chloroquine. I sure do. And shine that UV light. I'm not quite sure what orifice you might use, but good luck. Now, these folks are quite heroic. I am blessed to have more than one acquaintance who's a physician working in RERs this very day in this community of Tucson. And they're experiencing 9/11s around this country. When you think about the number of people who die every day, and that is why it's only fitting that the veterans of 9/11 would salute the brave responders who are doing their best today by going into the smoke day after day. Wash your hands off in America. Every hour of every day I wash my hands of responsibility. I include this because I did a second cartoon repeating this theme. And in that cartoon, I used the historical analogy of Pontius Pilate washing his hands of guilt and of responsibility. And I got a fair share of emails asking me who Pontius Pilate was and what that whole idea of cleansing, washing your hands of responsibility is and where it came from. Wow. Here's our governor, the ice cream man, the man who started the Stone Cold Creamery franchises in Arizona and sold them off and had a number of those poor suckers who bought his franchise go belly up. This is when he failed to act soon enough. I drew him as the ice cream man, handing out COVID-19, one scoop or two. And now it's such a delight to see him on TV. Why, just yesterday, looking somewhat sheepish about how he has screwed up and now has blood on his hands. In my opinion, the man's a mediocre intellect. He might be an MBA, but man, he is a craven toady. Trump, he'd kill to reopen this economy. Thousands. So my cartoons do provoke a lot of response. I typically get 20 to 30 emails a day and 3 to 4 voicemails. When my son, Matthew, graduated this year at the age of 17, this was a cartoon I drew in tribute to the poor kid. Hey, the torch has been passed. It's not really a torch. It's more or less a world set ablaze. Good luck, kid. You, sir, are going to be part of the greatest generation of this century because you have no choice. You blaspheme by mocking Holy Scripture. I love that criticism. That happens from time to time. If I use a biblical analogy or if I use Scripture itself, as I did with this cartoon. Using the 23rd Psalm, Dr. Fauci is my shepherd, I shall not walk quackery. He reassureth my soul. He leadeth us in the path of scientific reason for our species' sake. We shall fear no pandemic, for thou art with us. Thou anointest our hands with soap. Our ICUs runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow us all our lives at a distance of 6 feet. And we shall not dwell in this house forever. Amen. You know, it's too bad the policymakers didn't follow Dr. Fauci or the CDC's recommendation. Or right now, we might be done with this and be in a U-shaped recovery. Here's my optimistic viewpoint. That the handshake will happen in the spring of 2021. It could happen. Arizona, we get news. I do love to draw these creatures of the desert, the quail and the javelina and the tortoise. The tortoise hibernates this time of year, but he really went under a little bit earlier into his shell when the COVID arrived. And you see upper panel, the quail's walking past him. There's a lot of noise coming from inside that shell. Type, send, type, send. Huh, says the quail, I wish I could work from home. I am so blessed. I am among the fortunate. I have a roof. I have a job. I am safe and I am healthy. So lucky. Family of quail nearby. Look at the bicycle. See the tandem seats? Every once in a while, I do cartoons about life here in Tucson, Arizona, and you can find those in our Caliente section, and these are referred to as the Last Laugh cartoons. Cartoons come to me in many ways. Sometimes they come from just life experience. I was working on building a ramada in my backyard, and I had to go to the hardware store, and I was looking for wing nuts, and when I asked the gentleman where the wing nuts were, I realized I had a cartoon. Try Arizona, because man, that's where the wing nuts are. You could see it at the mega church in Phoenix last weekend, right? Last week, when all those citizens gleefully gathered out and packed together to create and cause their very own hotspot. So look, I think it's July 11th, or maybe it's the 7th of the time that the incubation should be over, and the numbers should be exploding even more so. And I'm going to include a little travelogue as part of this program, and it is relevant to the life of this political cartoonist. And when I finish my talk, I'll be more than happy to take your questions and comments. Munich. 3 years ago, I had the blessing to go to Munich, Germany with friends as a gift from my wife to me. And she knew I would enjoy it because I am a Nazi scholar. I am fascinated by the history of the rise of the Nazis. And Munich was where the Nazis really rose to power in Germany. And what you see behind us is part of beautiful Munich. Some of Munich survived the bombing by the Allies, but everything else around us in that city was flattened to the Stone Age by the Allies during the Second World War. Virtually nothing was left standing of Munich. I was so delighted to go to Munich because I wanted to visit a site that was sacred to me. And it's a site where an amazing, courageous act occurred. And it was inside a lecture hall at the University of Munich. It was kind of difficult to find, but after wandering around the lecture hall, I found it because I recognized this clock and I recognized these stairs. And when I turned to my right, what I saw was this balcony and the two double doors behind the three arches. And that is the great lecture hall where the Nazi Party Gestapo members were meeting in a national conference in the early 40s in Munich, Germany. And that is also where Sophie Scholl arrived with an armload of her essays mimeographed off on typing paper, which she had planned to set outside the door of that lecture hall on the floor for the Gestapo members to find and read. She arrived a little bit too late. The bell rang, and she just threw the papers off of the balcony and ran. The Gestapo member picked it up, read it, was immediately shot, blew his whistle. The dogs were unleashed, and Sophie Scholl was arrested. 21 years old, young lady simply hoping to become a kindergarten teacher. But much more than that, she was a dissident voice. And she acquired her dissident voice early in her life. When she was invited to her first Hitler Youth meeting, she was asked to identify her two favorite poets. And she stunned her friends and the group leader by telling them the names of her two favorite poems. Two favorite poets were two Jewish poets, and she recited aloud their poems. There was no applause. There was nothing but cold stares. She was shunned, and she was insulted by her group leader, and she left the group and never returned. She managed to find, in her teen years, other young people who agreed with her. She stood alone with her friends against the German, what she considered an occupation. And in fact, in her diary, a lot of it resonates with me now for the current moment in the United States. In Sophie's diary, at one point, she laments, How is it that this charismatic fool can attract so many ordinary, good people? I think some of us understand that feeling. On her blouse here, on her shirt, you'll see a flower. She referred to this as a rose. She called her dissident group the White Rose Society, a resistance group in Germany. On the left-hand side of the picture is her brother, who had returned from Stalingrad and informed her about the war. In the essay she dropped in front of the Gestapo in that lecture hall, she wrote about the conduct of the war, she wrote about Hitler, and she also wrote about the final solution, declaring it a known fact and a despicable act by the German people. As I noted, she was arrested. Sophie was tried within the week in front of a Nazi tribunal. Her trial was broadcast on national German radio. And by 5 o'clock, she was found guilty by the justices and sentenced to die. At that hour, she was taken downstairs. She had a brief moment to say goodbye to her mother and father and to greet the two other conspirators, her brother and her boyfriend. And then she was escorted into a basement room where a guillotine stood with two executioners in long, tall black hats. And she was executed. And the German, of course, the Nazis felt at that point, that was it. There'll be no more dissident voices. We'll eliminate every last dissident voice. They just didn't understand that you can't kill an idea that has moral force. This beautiful fountain stands outside the University of Munich at the entryway. It's a beautiful landmark. When my friends and I saw it, we found something even more astonishing and more beautiful, because at the base of this is a large, sweeping sort of entryway, an arcing driveway, a walkway, an entrance to the University of Munich. And it was quite beautiful, cobblestone. And looking closer, when we walked outside, we were surprised to see litter. It looked to be the homework of students that had been windblown and left behind on the street. But we looked a little bit closer, and we had with us a friend. She's seated to my left there with her daughter, who was German-born American, and she could read them. And what we discovered is that what we were looking at was the essays of Sophie Scholl. They had been bronzed, and they'd been embedded into the cobblestone, into the pavement at the entryway to the university. They were all over the pavement, everywhere. After being inside and being profoundly touched by what I seen, I have to admit, 3 of us began weeping. We were so touched by this to see these essays. And in fact, I discovered later that her essays had been smuggled out by family members to the Allies, and the Allies reprinted them, airdropped them on German citizens along with the bombs. They airdropped them by the millions. I was profoundly touched in Munich. Munich is very proud of the fact you cannot find swastikas or images of Nazi rule anywhere. But what you can find here outside the university for a monument to words that will endure the ages in bronze, the words of a 21-year-old student, young Sophie Scholl. And this here, this small little piece of paper is young Sophie Scholl's death notice. I was profoundly touched also inside, where there's a bust of Sophie Scholl near where she had stood and distributed her leaflets. There was a fresh white rose near the statue, and I turned to look at another plaque and saw a fresh bouquet of white roses. So there are some German citizens in Munich who are mindful of her courage, her resistance to autocracies. Her final words before perishing: ever hopeful, the sun still shines. We Americans like to believe we fear no idea. In spite of living in a country where the President of the United States is censoring scientists and censoring scientists' expression. You know, we don't fear any idea, and that was a revolutionary ideal. held by the founding fathers. Or here he is, the work of Benito Franklin, a snake cut up into these pieces. He believed that if you cut a snake up into pieces and reassembled them, the snake would return to life. And here Ben Franklin was arguing, get together to fight off the British. This cartoon was considered seditious. If Ben had been caught by the British, he would have lost his head. And I think that's part of why in the American Revolution, once the war was won, when it came to piecing together a game plan in the Constitution, they protected freedom of speech. And here's one kid who really understood what the American Revolution was all about, a kid from Phoenix, a veteran. During the Second World War, he really didn't want to go. He ended up in the National Guard thinking he'd be safe, but man, he was drafted and he was tossed into an infantry unit that spearheaded a campaign up through the underbelly of Europe, up through Italy. And Bill Mauldin not only was a pretty good marksman, but he was a great cartoonist. He drew cartoons that the troops loved because his cartoons accurately portrayed their plight. He was a voice for the fighting men and women. Here's an example of one of the most popular cartoons he ever drew, of the soldier slaying his beloved Jeep. I also include this one because it's great irony that later in his life, when he bounced around the country as an old retiree, he loved working on his Jeep. And in fact, at one moment, his Jeep actually fell on him and it injured him, and he died a short time later. This cartoon is significant. In it, he draws American soldier escorting German prisoners. Caption reads, "Fresh spirited American troops, flushed with victory, are bringing in thousands of hungry, ragged, battle-weary prisoners." This cartoon won the Pulitzer Prize. And you'll notice the American GI looks just as weary and hungry as his prisoner. Well, this cartoon upset the brass. It really upset his editors. And so he had no choice, actually, but to meet with one of his editors, his chief editor. Here he is, General George S. Blood and Guts Patton, who asked young Sergeant Mauldin if he thought his cartoons would be welcome in the Russian army or the German army. To which the Private Mauldin, Sergeant Mauldin, no doubt shivering in his boots, simply responded, "Isn't that the point, General?" In fact, that was the point. Armies of slaves never defeat armies of free men. And Bill Mauldin embodied that notion of freedom. You know, his cartoons were essentially what Americans were fighting for and what Americans were fighting about. Here's one of my favorite Bill Mauldin cartoons of all time. You might recognize this, particularly when you think of the date, November 23rd, 1963. He rendered this cartoon in response to the assassination of JFK, a beautiful, classic, timeless cartoon. You just can't kill a good idea. You just can't do it. Some people try. Government of China tried, thought they succeeded. Tiananmen Square, thousands of students gather, June of '81. Look in the background. There, facing the statue of Mao, turned to face Mao, the goddess of liberty, no doubt inspired by our own Statue of Liberty. Well, we know what happened. Thanks to a BBC journalist. He said one evening the Chinese decided to mount enormous drapes and curtains around the square. Later that night, he heard the roar and rumble of tanks that woke him up. He heard screams, gunfire, explosions, and he could tell that the Chinese government was massacring thousands and thousands of its own people. He said at one point, the curtains collapsed near his hotel and a tank ablaze rolled through, striking the base of his hotel, which he could view looking down from his balcony. He saw Chinese citizens pry open the tank hatch. Out came Chinese soldiers ablaze, and he said that the Chinese citizens were so enraged, they began ripping the limbs from the Chinese soldiers. Here's courage. That's amazing courage. Some people believe you cannot kill an idea. Individuals in those tanks, those stooges, just following orders of a regime that believes it can kill a good idea. No, you can't do it. You just can't do it. Even if you're a citizen in Tehran and you have a good idea, like perhaps fair and free elections, some governments are foolish enough to believe that you can forever suppress and oppress the people. It won't last. It won't endure. And one of my cartoons, I'm proud to say, during this period was widely distributed. And here it is. Cartoon depicting a mullahs believing that if you sever the people from their belief in liberty, they can put an end to it. No, can't do it. I'm proud to say that an Iranian-American professor now uses this talk in her conversation. She recently did a TED talk using this cartoon in a conversation about the tragedy of Iran. Words matter. This is important to me as a journalist because, as you know, we have a president of the United States who thought it was just a hilarious jape to declare that the press is the enemy of the people. The world listens. At one time, it listened to the United States before it began to pity us. Here's the case in point. This man, Khashoggi. Look at this guy. Look at his eyes. Honest, decent, ethical, courageous, a dissident voice, a writer, a brilliant orator, a brave man. Made the mistake of going to an embassy in Turkey in which he was invited. In Turkey, an ally of our country. And what happened to him? He was butchered. He was murdered by Saudi Arabian agents. You're right. Journalists are the enemy of the people. All Saudi Arabia did was simply confirm the belief of our despicable president. The whisper joke is an example of what I am talking about, the fearlessness of our society, how blessed we are that I can make the kind of remarks I do in public. As this one friend, I had a colleague who was from Russia. He was a news photographer in Russia, and he told me this story told to him by his father. Here's the joke. After meeting with Premier Khrushchev, a Russian apparatchik was arrested for shouting, "Khrushchev is a lunatic," as he left the Kremlin. The Soviet court sentenced him to 21 years in a Siberian gulag, 1 year for insulting the premier, and an additional 20 years for revealing a state secret. Bada boom, bada bing. And he said, no way could you speak aloud this joke, even in the ensuing years, not even after the fall of communism itself. This type of repression, for me, is just unimaginable. Growing up an American, I just can't grasp what it must be like to be unable to speak one's mind publicly. An example of being unable to speak one's mind publicly is a book I'm fascinated by, and I've yet to have delivered to my home, but look at this title, Dead Funny, Telling Jokes in Hitler's Germany. The headline says it all. You think you're funny? You're dead. Ali Farazat, another cartoonist. Look, he's got his pen there. That's his deadly weapon. And all he does is what I do. He just assembles lines on paper. It's amazing how some governments are terrified of lines on paper. This is an example of one of his cartoons. Hey, the government will not only inspect your bag, look what else they got to check out. Here he is critical of his own government in Syria, Assad's corrupt government. Under the name of nationalism, flying the flag, will engage in corruption and evil, corrupt patronage. Assad's stooges, following Assad's orders, went to Ali Farat's home and using concrete blocks, crushed his hands. Here he is laying in a bed in Damascus, where he was safely found refuge. What his response to me is remarkably poignant because within 2 days of this image, he himself tweeted out this self-portrait, which I think sums up the human hunger for dignity. You can't kill a good idea. You can try, but you can't do it. Now I'm off to Mexico City with a gathering of cartoonists, and we were gathering to encourage each other in these curious times, to honor the cartoonists who had died in the line of their work, and to also discuss the state of the journalism in Latin America, where cartoonists perish daily. My cartoons also, I have to say, I'm proud to say, were displayed at the Museum of Memory and Tolerance, a Holocaust museum in Mexico City. Here I am standing in front of a beautiful anti-violence monument made from semi-automatic weapons. Notice I have the wings, but I certainly don't have a halo. There's an example of one of my cartoons. Here in southern Arizona, Border Patrol was alleged to have destroyed some water stations which were set out there by a group called No Mas Muertes, No More Deaths, to simply save the lives of brown human beings who were dying in our godforsaken desert to the west of us. I think Tucson is not unlike Dachau, Germany, where the citizens would claim that they had no idea what was going on 10 miles to the west of them. For years, we in Tucson, we don't seem to be too enraged about the thousands of brown humans who perish in our godforsaken desert, let alone the brown children who are also in cages near our city. Well, in this case, I drew a cartoon saying, man, Border Patrol, you've changed the group from no more deaths to more deaths. The name of our meeting was La Línea de Fuego, the line of fire, and here's some cartoonists who've taken fire. On the left there, just below me, which is up to the right of Pedro Molina's name, he's on his knees down below. Love this man, the man who said to me, David, will you please stop speaking Spanish? You're hurting us. You speak like a toddler. So I did. Pedro Molina came to this conference to tell us he was very proud that he had one time been a supporter of Daniel Ortega, but now he'd been drawing cartoons harshly critical of Ortega and his corruption. And then we learned that very same day that he was prohibited from ever returning to Nicaragua. Fortunately, a university in the United States, New England, took him under their wing. Lower right-hand corner, Nadia Chiare. This wonderful woman from Tunisia played a significant role in the Arab Spring, the revolution that began in Tunisia. And she did it spreading the ideals of the Arab Spring Revolution through a cartoon character, a cat called Willis. Now you should be proud of yourselves, Americans, because Willis, this cat in this cartoon you can see, is striking a pose inspired by an American iconographic image, Rosie the Riveter. Thank you, Willis. These two guys, two of my best friends internationally among cartoonists. They are brothers. They both work in Jordan, and they are troublemakers. They have both been to jail for their cartoons from time to time. And here's an anecdote I want to share with you. Being from Arizona, we were talking about religion. And Imad said that he had once met a Mormon missionary and asked me if we had Mormons in Arizona. And I said, yeah. And I told him that here in Arizona, Mormons have a word for Mormons who are not devout. They refer to them as Jack Mormons. Imad laughed at that and said, well, we must be Jack Muslims. Because neither of these individuals were, they were both irreligious men, which really set them apart from their culture. They were critical of the sexism in their culture. And so they would often draw cartoons that cost them their freedom from time to time. So to me, they were both quite heroic and remarkably good-humored about what they have endured. And I include this image because I'll talk a little bit more about Imad, my friend in the middle, a little bit later. Well, here's one of his cartoons, by the way, a recent cartoon he drew about John Bolton. To the left, we have Donald Trump's tie and talking to the snake-like bookmark of the John Bolton book. What a clever, brilliant cartoon. I admire cartoonists who use very few words. I tend to be pretty darn verbose. France? France? What am I doing in France? Well, I'm attending a global cartooning forum I want to tell you about, and a cartoonist festival in Saint-Just-le-Martel I want to tell you about. Why was the cartooning forum in Paris relevant and important? Boom. Well, I'll tell you. There was a gathering of 300 cartoonists from around the world to talk about the state of our craft because it is under threat. Whoa, pretty impressive hall where we met. What the heck was I doing there? And was I even actually there? You bet I was. And so was security. Why was security so high in Paris for a gathering of cartoonists? Because this is where the Charlie Hebdo massacre had occurred. Charlie Hebdo is a crude, vulgar, highly offensive cartoon publication, akin to sort of a Mad magazine on steroids. It's vulgar, it's naughty, and you don't need an interpreter to read it and enjoy it. They would often mock and ridicule religion, which upset radical Islamic terrorists who went into the offices of Charlie Hebdo with combat weaponry and gunned down the staff of Charlie Hebdo, killing 12, injuring 11, and here are the 9 Charlie Hebdo cartoonists and writers that were murdered. The streets of Paris were filled with protests and protesters, and the protest, by the way, went global. And I can't recall the name of it, but I recommend you a wonderful documentary about the Charlie Hebdo incidents because the French were flippin' impressive at their ability to capture the 2 terrorists who had fled to the outskirts of Paris and simultaneously dispatched to Paradise a terrorist working in league with them who had gone into a delicatessen, I believe, killed some customers and taken a number of hostages. But the French police were able to dispatch all 3 monsters to Paradise, rescuing the hostages. Boom. So, you can't kill a good idea. That was the theme of our forum, in fact, where we discussed the fact that A, newspapers are dying. Are you kidding? No. In Mexico? Yes. Africa? Yes. India? Yes. Asia? Yes. It's global. Newspaper readership plunging around the world. The internet is killing the free press. That's where we met, in that ridiculous looking ice cream cake, bridal cake of a meeting hall. Hey, this is what global cartoonists look like. Okay, American, French, American, Australian, and then to the right, we have Indian, and then to the far right, a Tunisian. Look at this guy, an Australian from France. Or was he a Frenchman from Australia? Iran. He and I, it was interesting how much political agreement we shared between us. And now I have to admit, I'd worried for this kind of political voice in a country like Iran. This fellow from Great Britain was originally a refugee from Africa, where his cartoons were not welcome. But now he thrives in Great Britain. India. Turkey. I include this because here's another heartbreaking story. This fine, young, talented, brilliant cartoonist, he arrives at this forum in Paris with his cartoons in hand, and the day of the conference, he informs the group he had just learned that he had been banned from ever returning to Turkey, an ally supported by President Trump and the United States. Well, fortunately, France is generous towards political refugees, and I've spoken to him recently. He's doing okay. I did enjoy Paris. Yes, I did. I have to admit it. On to Saint-Just-les-Martels, taking a train 3 hours south of Paris to the middle of nowhere for a festival of satire started 30-some years ago, where 300 cartoonists would gather and where we would be stared at like zoo animals, and we would meet thousands and thousands of Europeans who'd come from all over the continent to look at us and meet us. This is the Salon International. And we rode on the train with Igmar and his wife, Lena. Lena had a magic purse because in that purse, she had champagne glasses and champagne and salads. And we love Lena. This is Saint-Just-les-Martels on a very busy day. We were surprised to find no cafes, no shops, no restaurants, no clubs, no hotels, nothing but farmhouses, a high school, and the center of town. That was it. Wow. Here's the most popular pastime in Saint-Just, consuming wine. Wonderful tradition. I discovered that the French enjoy consuming wine beginning at 10 a.m. every day. I love that tradition. This is what 300 cartoonists look like. And I want you to meet someone I really enjoyed meeting, Claude, my host. He's my age, a retired middle school teacher, and I want to share with you what he said to me. He told me, David, I wanted to tell you about a trip I had just taken. I had never visited the Normandy before in my life. You know, it's like an American who lives in New York and never goes to see the Statue of Liberty. Well, I'd never seen the cemetery in Normandy. And he said he was just amazed by the sacrifice of the Americans. And I was touched. And it was kind of a profound coincidence because I could share with him that a Captain Fitzsimmons had fallen on that day, on June 6th, 44, when he was struck by a Nazi bullet as the gate to his landing craft dropped down. And then we had a conversation about how America and France have been such good, strong allies and how each of us had benefited. So I thanked him for his contribution to our American Revolution and American revolutionary thought. And I also thanked him for Marquis de Lafayette. I thanked the French people for the Statue of Liberty. And most importantly, Brigitte Bardot. Here's Claude, here's his mistress and his wife. Shame on me, not true, fake news, fake news. The woman in the middle is their dear friend. Wonderful, generous, kind people. Hey, there were just too many cartoonists at this conference. Look at us. Oh man, from all over the planet. Bulgaria, even. France. Is that a French intellectual face? My goodness. I love this fellow from the south of France because he learned to speak English by listening to Monty Python on BBC. He had a delightful accent. There's that French intellectual, my good friend Steve Sack of the Minneapolis Tribune. He's been drawing some beautiful cartoons about the George Floyd tragedy. Oh, Terry Anderson, a well-known European cartoonist from Scotland. It was fun that we'd all take turns walking up to him to ask him what he thought of Brexit and Boris Johnson, just to watch his head blow off his shoulders. I think he despised Trump. I think he despised Boris Johnson more than I despise Trump. Here's what cartoonists look like from all over the world. These dissident voices from Gaza, Iran, Jordan. Hey, there she is, that dame again, my bride. My cartoons. Oh, I was so proud. If the master sergeant, my dad, could only see his son's work in France. Yeah, that was fun. We did a lot of drawing of each other. There I am thanking a gendarme. Thank you so much for the security. Here's what cartoonists look like when we dress up. To the left, a British cartoonist named Marshall, American cartoonist named Fitz, a Utah cartoonist named Pat Bagley, and a wonderful British cartoonist whose name escapes me. Maybe I'll just call her Aphasia. I was there actually because I hoped to win the cow. The best cartoonist in the world, judged by ourselves, would win that cow at that festival. Sadly, I did not win that cow, and I don't know who did in fact win that cow, because the truth is none of us really didn't care because nobody wanted to win the cow. What are you going to do with the cow? Are you going to do what one cartoonist did? Are you actually going to take the cow with you and take the cow all the way up to the Eiffel Tower as this cartoonist did? Well, maybe, or probably not. Quickly, I was in Montmartre when I encountered a caricature artist. And this reminds me of how much I love drawing caricature. That's how I got my start in the back of the classroom, drawing caricatures, drawing human faces. I love to draw human faces. I typically start with the hair or the hat and sort of work my way down to the nose. And once I figured out the nose, I've got the center of the face, the eyes and the smile just naturally follow. And I gotta admit, I have become pretty quick at it, a quick draw, but you know, I should be, having done this for, well, I'm 64 and I've been doodling pretty much since I was 7. Well, he insisted on drawing a caricature of me in spite of the fact I told him I was a caricature artist, so he settled on a trade. He's told me he liked his work of art, and I was really flattered by this beautiful cartoon, which that fine artist gave to me. One of the common criticisms, your work's unfunny and derivative. Odds are good it won't be funny if you disagree with me. And well, a lot of cartoons are derivative, primarily because of the kind of imagery we use. We derive our imagery from iconographic images you see all around you from time to time. For example, this cartoon. Looks familiar. It's a man standing up against what looks to be tanks. Oh no, they're not tanks, they're cranes, they're construction equipment, and they're carrying pieces of the border wall. And they're heading for a site sacred to the Tana Autumn people here in southern Arizona, the site called Quito Baquito Spring. And here's the symbolism in the cartoon. The male figure on the bottom is wearing the blue shirt, and he has the symbol of the Tana Autumn native peoples. It's called the man in the maize icon, and he's holding a feather, which signifies sacredness and tribal leadership. So here's the lone man standing up against the president's drive to build a pointless, absurd boondoggle called a wall. Don't you have an editor, for God's sake? Well, yeah, I do. It's amazing when I can slip past them. Newsflash, that's not birdseed. I was proud of that getting past my editor. My editor didn't really hear about it until she got a couple of interesting pieces of mail over the cartoon. I thought it was pretty funny. Innocent, completely innocent. So is this one of my favorites. 50 Shades of Grey. It's a hair salon in Sun City. Harmless, but cute, I think. I love being a cartoonist. I'm so lucky to be at the Arizona Daily Star in Tucson, a newspaper which is weathering this economic strife remarkably well. We are breaking even. And man, I can't tell you how much I love living in Tucson. Could not wait to return from exile in the middle of my youth to Tucson in my 30s. I love the politics of Arizona and the beautiful desert. And I'm a desert rat. I love the weather. And I love telling tourists what you tell them whenever they complain about the heat, right? You got to say this, but it's a dry heat. Yeah. My hero, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. Why is he my hero? He's a perfect example of the power of humor when addressing a political issue. He could have written a humorless screed about slavery, arguing for abolition. Instead, this genius chose to write a book about a boy and an escaped slave named, it was Tom and Jim. And young Tom Sawyer has conversations with Jim. And what do you know? Jim sounds like a human being. his book, Tom Sawyer, had more impact on the views of Americans about slaves and about blacks than I would assume just about any other media publication of that age and era. It's amazing what a little sugar can do to make an unpleasant idea, an idea that's unpleasant for that age, palatable to the average citizen. Also, Mark Twain, I love this saying, sacred cows make the best hamburger. He had no sacred cows. I've always been stunned at how accepted he was, considering how irreligious he was. One of my favorite Twain quotes, in fact, about religion is, "There's only one Christian I know of, and they crucified him early on." Well, that pretty much concludes my PowerPoint. I'm Dave Fitzsimmons, cartoonist, the Arizona Daily Star. I'm going to attempt to stop my screen sharing and get back to, happily, taking questions from you. So, Mr. Aldridge, do we have some questions you'd like me to answer? Or
We do. And also just to let everybody know, you can use the chat below button to submit questions, and we'll try to bring you on with your audio, and you can ask them directly. While I'm pulling up the first question, I know we had one that was emailed into us very early on that said, "What were you like as a fourth grader?"
Oh, as a fourth grader, I was painfully shy because you're looking at the poster boy for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and the way I dealt with my inadequacy as a student and that embarrassment was simply to be a ghost-like, relatively quiet kid. It was middle school when the ADHD really skyrocketed and got out of hand. And I was rescued from myself by wonderful teachers.
So I'm going to try to bring on James Cortez. If you can, I think you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hi. I just recently started to pay attention to your cartoons a little bit more recently, so I really enjoy them. Kind of makes you think. But a couple of questions I have. Have any of your drawings ever been censored or not posted for any reason, and what were the circumstances?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Cortez. Before I answer that question, I'm going to do a sideways step with this fun fact no one can tell. My editors are aware I'm syndicated, so if they ever are moved to censor a cartoon of mine, they know that I'm just going to put it up through my syndicate, and it will show up, reprinted in the Washington Post, Denver Post, or LA Times. So I have that going for me. In the past, when I have had cartoons, I've had them edited for spelling or grammatical errors. The last time I had a cartoon actually censored was when Clarence Thomas was appearing before the Senate hearing, and the Anita Hill issue rose up. And I drew a cartoon making use of a direct quote about the Supreme Court justices' reading habits. And my editor felt very uncomfortable with me making light of and note of his remarks about pornography, and which I completely understood, actually. And I simply had a second cartoon ready to go. I am very blessed among cartoonists to have this remarkable degree of freedom. It also helps to be much older than most of my peers in the newsroom as well. It's like, I'm going to censor that old man. So sure.
And then just real quick one is, after you did your drawing, is there one that you decided, well, I'm not going to post this and have to redraw it, or, like from your own thinking about it?
That's a very good question. I will tell you, that rarely happens. I'm very good at censoring myself, aware that the Star would describe itself as a family publication, in spite of the fact I think most of my readers are 55 and older. But I am pretty darn good at censoring myself. If I have a naughty cartoon in mind, many years ago when I worked in the newsroom, these drawings would find their way to many an office desk where they would be squirreled away and they wouldn't see the light of day. But that's as far as the naughty cartoons would ever get. But I'm pretty good at censoring myself. Good questions. Thank you.
I'm going to bring on Rod Norris. If you can unmute yourself. There you go. You're on.
Okay, I'm just wondering if you ever take on in your cartoons the U.S. Congress or the U.S. Supreme Court, and if you do, who are your favorite characters to go after, and do you ever get any kind of direct feedback or pushback from any of these folks in Washington?
Mr. Norris, good question. I immediately think, yes. In fact, I've kind of pulled back from that habit. I really love national politics, following congressional politics and the Supreme Court. But I find when readers react to it, I get this sense that sometimes the Supreme Court feels like it's too inside baseball, which kind of distresses me, but full speed ahead. Of course, what the Supreme Court does merits commentary. I love to draw, for my own amusement, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a very heroic figure in my mind. I used to love to draw William Rehnquist, this ridiculous Supreme Court robes inspired by Gilbert and Sullivan. And as far as Congress people, I always enjoyed drawing Arizona Senator John McCain. And I always admired him, and he's always remarkably friendly towards me. We met a number of occasions. And I have to say, the very first time I met him, I was awestruck, coming from a military family. His record, his survival of the prisoner of war experience just left me gaga and honored to shake his hand and meet him. And he was always remarkably good-humored and self-deprecating about his political beliefs in private conversations. So I'm really digressing here talking about Congress, but I want to get back to a quick answer to that. Yes, my favorite response, this is how long ago it was, Senator Jesse Helms had been upset about an NEA grant funding, I think, a show of Mapplethorpe's photographs. I cannot remember the cartoon I drew, but I do remember that he wrote me a letter and he closed it with, "You, sir, engage in the kind of character assassination that does not surprise me coming from a low liberal like yourself. Signed, Senator Jesse Helms." I was so pleased with that. I framed it, and then much to my regret, I gave it away to a fan a few years ago. But yeah, I love hearing from folks that I ding. Good question. Thank you.
We have Marilyn Paulo, I believe. Marilyn, I'm trying to unmute you there. If you can. There you go.
Yes, my question is, do you have cartoons in the hopper, say for one for November after the election and if Trump loses?
Yes, I sometimes have cartoons in the hopper. We cartoonists refer to them as evergreens. That's also true of columns. I have evergreen columns in the hopper. Those are the just in case cartoons. And I have to admit, I did not have one in 2016 ready. I was fairly confident that Hillary would have won, but I know when the returns started coming in, I quickly sketched together a stunned and shocked Uncle Sam cartoon. I do tend to work ahead. Usually 1, 2, 3 cartoons ahead. For example, for our fireworks-free 4th of July, I've started to work on a cartoon of our 4th of July here in Arizona for this coming next Saturday. And of course, it features the bursts of fireworks looking very much like coronavirus. It's not very witty or clever. It's just a pretty somber cartoon about how we Arizonans are going to celebrate our independence from scientific, rational thought. Good question. Thank you, Ms. Hollow.
I've got Enid Boss. So try to unmute yourself there.
Hi. My question actually you already answered. So it was just about how many political cartoonists are around today. So I'm done. Thanks.
Well, I like that question. That was a very good question.
All right, I'm sending you a message privately anyway on Facebook, so you'll see it later.
Oh, good, good, good.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, you know, by the end of this COVID-19 pandemic, who knows how many cartoonists will be left? One or two have taken the smart leap to surviving off of Patreon, like my friend Rob Rogers, who was kicked off the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette so that the pro-Trump editor could hire a fellow named Steve Kelly to replace him. Steve Kelly once told me in conversation, he said, you know, I'm so proud of my son. I asked my son who the most oppressed minority in America is, and my boy said, white men, Dave. I'm so proud of him. I was speechless. I mean, what can you say? It's like, really? You believe that? You're the most oppressed minority in America? Good grief. So yeah, cartoonists, yeah, we're endangered. Our numbers are shrinking.
Robin Kirk, if you'd like to unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi, David. I'm a local girl who grew up in Tucson, and I know you went to Rincon, and you go way back too. We're living through this horrendous fire of our beloved Catalinas right now. Do you have any commentary, or are you going to do anything in our local paper about our sadness about the Catalinas completely burning?
Yeah, I've been thinking about a great deal. I've been thinking about I did draw one cartoon, in a sense, comparing the COVID-19 pandemic here to the fire itself. The point being that neither one are being contained effectively. And I've been thinking about a cartoon about one of the primary causes of the fire being so extensive, particularly killing off plant life that's precious to us here, saguaros. And that would be the buffalo grass. And the cartoon idea came to me along the lines of hearing the phrase, it was incendiary outside agitators that came in to fuel the protest. And I was thinking, wow, you know, what was fueling Mother Nature's protest here was a flammable outside agitator, and that would be the buffalo grass plants as well. You guys get calls to mind also. I did a cartoon a few years back when there was a terrible fire on Mount Lemmon, and it's simply in the smoke drifting up off the Catalinas were all the memories that many of us shared about, you know, first hike, first camp out, first canoodling with a boyfriend or girlfriend. Yeah, these are interesting times we are witnessing. But I am hopeful that here in Tucson, our late summer, thanks to the monsoons, will be green and beautiful. Thanks for the question.
Got Jan Hannah Simon, I believe. You're unmute yourself.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
really appreciate the story you told about Sophie when you were in Munich, Germany. I had heard of her, but not that much. And how did you get your interest in the history of Nazis?
Two ways. The first was from my older brother. He was an Air Force officer. He was stationed in Germany. He attended Heidelberg University. So I don't know what Air Force base would have been nearby, but my nerdy, wonderful brother, the colonel, was quite the scholar. And so he came back to visit when I was a kid and I was a young teenager. And he turned me on to William Shirer's book about the rise of the Third Reich. And he told me anecdotally his stories about Nazism in Germany, which intrigued him. And I remember him telling me how he was taken aback by the idea that, you know, a simple chicken farmer, give him a uniform and a gun, and they can turn an individual into a monster, which can do remarkable things. The second influence that really pushed me towards the stories of Sophie Scholl and the Dissonant Voice was when I first began drawing cartoons at the Star and I was asked to speak to groups. I was profoundly privileged to be invited by, I think it's Jewish Children and Family Services, to address a group of Holocaust survivors. I was nervous as heck. What am I going to say? I don't want to hear me. I want to hear your stories. But I plowed in, did my quick 10 minutes, and then I listened to the stories. And one woman there named Wanda told such amazing stories and with such good humor. And she made mention of these different resistance movements that I might have been unaware of. And that's essentially what shuttled me in that direction. Because I always wrongly assumed that there is virtually little resistance. I was unaware how much resistance there was and how many individuals had in fact perished at the hands of the Nazis, fighting against them all the way. Good question, Ms. Simon.
Got Michael. I'm gonna butcher your last name, Michael. I'm sorry. Johnno? If you can unmute yourself. There you go.
Hello. It's Junio.
Junio, sorry so much.
So if you were in Italy right now, it would be the month of Junio.
Perfect.
I really like your Can't Kill a Good Idea. It really hits home, and I think it's a great theme. Anything on Moscow Mitch that you could share? Any cartoons that you did?
I haven't, I've drawn him, I drew him in the distant past. I haven't drawn him yet. It's funny, being a cartoonist in the Western United States, I'm often thinking about what's on the mind of Westerners. And Mitch is fun to watch and draw. And typically if I draw a cartoon about Trump, I can't resist but include Mitch. And I have drawn him on one or two occasions. I can't really remember the cartoons distinctly. But yeah, I hate to say I'm a Mitch scholar, but he's an intriguing political biography of a kind of a horrifying corruption. It's just, yeah. Thanks for bringing him up after lunch and after breakfast. But yeah, you can't kill a good idea. Thanks for the question.
Got Richard Woodward. Richard, if you can unmute yourself.
Excuse me. Have you ever had a chance to meet her block?
That's a wonderful question. I never had the opportunity to meet him in person. However, when I was 14 years old, I had a sense I wanted to be a political cartoonist. And I remember telling the Master Sergeant, Dad, about this. And he was a very practical-minded man, of course. And he sort of wanted me to do a little research about careers. So I wrote a letter to her block, and I was stunned because within 2 weeks, I received this handwritten, 2 pages, this handwritten letter from her block himself, signed, full of advice, kind counsel, a very kind set of critiques of the cartoons I had sent to him. And at the time when I wrote to him, I was 14. That was 1883. If I'd been a couple years older, I could have voted for Lincoln. But at the time I wrote to him, he was the king of cartoons in the United States, working for the Washington Post. And I had admired him because he was so sharp when it came to criticizing Richard Nixon. And in fact, Nixon canceled his subscription to the Post because of her block's cartoons. But nope, I never met him. Good question.
Stella Miles, if you can unmute yourself, Stella.
Yes.
You are
Yeah.
on. Go ahead.
I am an LA member at Central Tucson. Oh, excuse me, sorry. And heard you speak earlier, and I'm so glad to hear you again. My question is about, recently I saw the comic strip Non Sequitur by Wiley Miller in a San Francisco paper. So I was glad to see it still being published someplace. Do you think, believe it was dropped in February 2019 because of a certain reference he made that some considered profane about Trump,
Yes.
and which he said he forgot to erase some doodling. Do you think he really forgot? And I would sure like to see him in more papers. I think it was not a fair punishment. Maybe he should have been fined, but we need him. He as much as we need you.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. And I'm really struck by your kindness that you would have seen me in person at Ollie, but yet you're willing to endure even more torment by seeing me on Zoom. As for Mr. Miller's cartoon, I've always been a fan of Wiley Miller's work, particularly when I discovered his political cartoons, which I think appeared in the San Jose Mercury News for a period of time, before he began drawing the wonderful comic strip, which I enjoyed. But I must say, I don't believe, and it's a question of belief, I don't believe he could have not known or done it by accident. For me, it was like the act of suicide. How could you send this out to your editors and in fact betray the trust of your editors, betray the trust of your clients who are running your cartoons, because it was very tiny near his signature and hard to see. I was shocked and dismayed by it. And in fact, I encouraged my editorial staff's policy of banning him from the page. Upon reflection, I think, well, ban him perhaps for a year. Perhaps that would be sufficient. But what he did really was, among we cartoonists, we're sticklers about ethics, because really that's all we have. The ability to draw, or same thing for a journalist, the ability to write, the ability to communicate. All you really have is your integrity and your trustworthiness. And to us, that's a sacred trust that we want to encourage. Another way we cartoonists are sticklers are about plagiarism as well. That's one area I think where we're humorless. Plagiarism and misusing the pulpit of the editorial cartoon. Particularly as Wiley did with his coarse, vulgar graffiti. So thanks for the question. That was a very good question.
Steve Myrick, if you can unmute yourself. Steve, there you go.
Yes, I was wondering if you think that Trump's appointment of so many judges is having any effect on censorship in the United States.
That is a very good question. I have to admit, I have not studied the biographies of the appointed judges. I rely on the judgment of my friends. I have two friends who are attorneys. One of them makes the joke that, hey, I've been called a criminal lawyer, but that's not true. Well, that was cute. But they inform me about the judges. But what I do know in a general sense about these judges is they're not just simply lawyers in a general sense who are promoted to judgeships. By and large, they're radicals. They are toxic, dangerous wingnuts. And wingnuts, particularly on the right and or the left, are both given to extreme views about freedom of expression and freedom of speech. I would not be at all surprised if a number of rulings will come forward from these judges restricting free expression. That's the most toxic vestige left in the wake of the Trump presidency. I think a lot of the other damage which has been done can hopefully be undone over a period of years. Man, that's going to require a massive rebooting of these various institutions which have been mortally wounded. But good question, Mr. Myrick. Good question.
We've got time for a couple more. We've gone a little long. If everybody's happy hanging in there for a few minutes. I think we'll keep going. Maria Gardetta Healy, if you would please unmute yourself. Maria, are you there?
Well, no, this is not Maria. This is her husband.
There you go. Go for it.
Well, I wrote a comment, actually, or a chat, that on April 24th, 2015, the Arizona Daily Star published a column by you entitled Trade in Pancho Villa for a True Hero, in which you refer to the statue of the Mexican revolutionary as the, quote, god-awful 5-ton statue of the murderer, and suggest taking down Pancho and putting up a statue to Cesar Chavez. Do you still feel that way? And incidentally, I do.
Your question delights me. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, I do feel the same way. You know, the city just accepted it because it was a gift. So it's like, I don't know about you, but usually I just re-gift gifts like that. But yeah, I do feel strongly. Anyone doing a quick superficial read of Pancho Villa's history, you got to question honoring such a scurrilous individual. I'll say it's an attractive statue. It's a shame it's of a specific individual who is a historical beast. But yeah, I would love to see it replaced by a statue honoring Cesar Chavez. You know, Cesar Chavez is Arizona's own. He's a local hero of sorts. And he's a man I would love to see us embrace and heroicize. And in fact, downtown, I wouldn't like to just see that statue of Pancho Villa replaced with a likeness of Cesar Chavez. I would like to see a colossus replace that statue, a colossus of Cesar Chavez. But I do know a larger-than-life statue of Cesar Chavez has been commissioned and will be set at an area in Tucson called 5 Points, which is a significant urban crossroads near downtown. So we will be getting a marvelous tribute to Cesar Chavez. But yeah, take Pancho Villa down. Good point, good question. Thank you.
Well, we have a great comment, and it might be a wonderful way to take us on home today. Susan Rubin is saying, we really miss watching you draw live. Any chance you could get him to do a drawing now on the webinar?
Yes.
You want to see a political cartoonist in his natural habitat.
Get this right. Are we ready?
Let's go.
The easiest character to draw. I usually start with the banana-shaped hair. There's no point in me talking about how ridiculous this man's hair is. A ducktail on an adult his age? All right. Boom. Love this face. Boom. Notice I love to draw in sort of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon style. I think I was influenced by the work of the early Fred Flintstone animators. Boom. Boom. Love that big mouth. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-huh. Whoa. Boom. Boom. I bet you can recognize this fellow. Love those eyes. Boom. Boom. Unkempt hair. Boom. And then that ridiculous tie. Woo-hoo. Freckles. President Trump. And I guess I better sign it and devalue it. Fitzsimmons. The Arizona Daily Star. That's me. Now, I think because I love this country, I'll go ahead and burn this. Shame on me. Thank you for that. Thank you for that request. It's been a tremendous joy for me to spend this time with all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Fitz, and we really appreciate it. And the saddest part about these webinars, I always say, is you don't get to hear the thunderous applause right now because I can't unmute everybody, but I know that you have been a great supporter of us and of all the U of A, and as one of our well-seasoned members anyway, we are an honorary member as far as I'm concerned, and all the help you have done, and we really appreciate it. We really appreciate you being a wonderful resource for our organization and to the community. And thank you so much for your time today, and thank everybody for joining in from all over the United States and all the way from Tucson, our own Ollie U of A members. We really appreciate your support. We hope you're enjoying this new speaker series. July 10th is our next one, and we've got another couple coming up here in July on the COVID-19 and mental health challenges. So please stay tuned with us, and thank you all again for joining us, and thanks, Fitz, so much again.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
Lots of great chat information I'll save for you. Lots of great comments that you'll want to read back later when you have time. But thank you all so much, and have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you back at Ollie next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.